One of the deepest debates in the history of philosophy, and honestly one of the richest and most interesting, is whether we should be living primarily active lives, lives devoted to justice and activism and the service of others in our community, or whether we should be living more contemplative lives, lives where we're thinking deeply about the biggest intellectual questions that we can ponder, right? Whether we should be reading poetry and examining human knowledge in all of its breadth, right? Now, an interesting figure in the recent history of philosophy who has something new and fresh and kind of exciting to say about this is actually Martin Luther King Jr. So in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, which remember, Martin Luther King Jr. was actually writing in jail, right, for having come to Birmingham and protested some of the laws that were being enacted. Martin Luther King Jr., he asks some really big questions about how our good, about how our flourishing is interconnected with the flourishing of others. So here's the context that you need to know. Martin Luther King Jr. comes to Birmingham, he's protesting, and some white clergymen write a letter in a newspaper. It's a public letter. And it basically says, look, you're not even from here. These laws, while we agree, shouldn't be on the books. We can gradually change them. You should just wait. We need to be patient. We need to work gradually for justice, right? And Martin Luther King, in some of the most inspiring prose from the history of philosophy, says, and I'm going to read this quote. He says, look, I'm cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. So he's saying, I'm not just an outside agitator. I'm not just coming in and taking advantage of civil unrest. He says, I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. This is just incredibly inspiring prose, right? But it's grounded in a deeply philosophical tradition, a tradition that today is often referred to as the natural law tradition. In the letter and in his other writings, King is actually referring to figures like Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, even all the way back to Socrates and Aristotle. And he's making an argument that an unjust law, a law that requires you to treat certain people in your community in a way that's fundamentally unjust, it can't have the force of law itself. Where does he get this? Well, Augustine and Aquinas, for instance, they think that the law is supposed to reflect or mirror what they think of as divine or eternal law, right? So law only has the force, the sort of bindingness that we typically associate with it, its authority, if it's in accord with this higher form of law, this eternal law, this divine law. So he thinks, if you're in a community that has an unjust law, you've got a duty that's grounded in your religious beliefs, right? And remember who he's talking to here, to disobey that, to at least make it manifest, right? So you could start by saying, look, this is unjust. And of course they did that, right, in Birmingham. But if it's met with so much resistance that eventually the only way to make it clear to the people that you're engaging with and talking to that you do not think it has the bindingness, the authority of law, is to break that law. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. thinks there's a very particular way to do this. You want to break this in a peaceful protest, right? A nonviolent protest, which itself is a very particular process that he goes through. But if you can do this, right, you can enact the injustice of the law in a way that makes it a problem for the community. Now, again, I don't mean sort of a bother or a nuisance for the community, though it certainly could do that. But it makes it a problem for the community in the following way. If in my family, I'm not treating my son very well, I have a 5-year-old son, if I'm not treating him very well, right? And I continue just habitually not to listen to him, right? At the end of every day, I'm just tired. I'm just go read the book. I don't know. And I'm doing this habitually and I'm not realizing what I'm doing. One problem in our family, which is the unit in which we flourish or don't, in which we're happy or we're not, is that there's a disconnect, right? My son's good is not being respected, and that needs to be brought to my attention in some way. Now, of course, he's going to bring it to my attention by just telling me, right? And hopefully, if I'm a good dad, and I am a good dad, I'm just going to respond to that in the right sort of way. But suppose in a community, something gets built into the norms and the conventions, the practices, even the law, right? That a lot of people think, yeah, that's perfectly okay. And that they'll only realize is not okay if they see the effects of that, right? If they see the effects of segregation firsthand, if they see that up close, and if they see what happens when that law is broken, right? So by manifesting that injustice, by manifesting the unjust nature of the laws themselves, Martin Luther King Jr. thinks we can draw on this rich tradition, natural law theory, to actually justify the actions of those protesters, of those activists. Now, this is really interesting because, again, at the end of the day, Martin Luther King was a trained philosopher. He read Socrates, he read Aristotle, and he didn't disagree with them. He didn't think we shouldn't contemplate our lives, we shouldn't live contemplative lives, but he thought in the world that we actually exist in, we've got to integrate these two sides of ourselves. We've got to be contemplative and we've got to be active, right? Otherwise, we're going to fail to achieve the ultimate goal that Socrates, that Aristotle, that other virtue ethicists set out for us, right? And that is happiness. We're not going to achieve that thing. So Martin Luther King Jr. gives us this really stark, really interesting example of somebody who's managed to integrate these two things. And I think the exciting area that this debate is going to go into in the future, and is already there to some extent, is giving philosophical models on which we can be contemplatives in action, right? Or we can be activists that are contemplative, that we can somehow bring these things together in the context of a whole and well-lived life.